Good evening. First of all, these questions are not too difficult, but I would like to call this to your attention. In answering questions, you must remember that there is really no such thing as an absolute yes or an absolute no to any question. When Jesus stood before Pilate and Pilate said, "What is truth?" Jesus could have answered and said, "I am." But he didn't. And the reason is that in one sense the answer was truth, but in the other sense it would have been fiction. In other words, in the sense in which Jesus meant it, my spiritual identity is the I am, or God. But just think of how it would have sounded to Pilate. With no spiritual background, he would have said, "Aha, the Jews are right. You are claiming that you are God. You are making yourself equal with God." And so you see the difficulty of giving an answer. So it is with us. I may give you an answer in accord with the light that I have received in these many years, and you, without that light, or with less of that light, might interpret it from an entirely different standpoint. And so it is that you must bear with me in my answer to your questions, because in some cases I will be able to satisfy you, but not in all cases, because we may be looking at the question from two different standpoints. And in some of these, it may be that you already have more light on them than I do, for I'm a long, long way from having received light on everything. A long way from it. Now, over here we have, how can we be sure we are not looking for bigger loaves and fishes? Well, now you know the answer to that as well as I do. You only have to search your heart. And as you search your heart, it tells you, sometimes it'll laugh right in your face. Because how can a question like that arise in one's thought? How can there be such a thing as a question in anyone's thought? Would Jesus, would the disciples have asked themselves such a question? Would any religious disciple ask themselves such a question? Certainly not. It would be an impossibility. Because when you are called of the Spirit, you're not only not seeking loaves and fishes, you are leaving your nets. No such question can arise. Then the answer to the question is, since that question is in your thought, the answer is, go back and purify yourself, for there is still some reason for this search within you. That's how it seems to me. In the event of an internal claim with its discomfort not yielding to treatment, is it wiser to have the best available medical advice than to go on suffering? No one can answer that question but you yourself. Only you know whether you have gone the full distance in seeking spiritual help, whether you have given all of your own understanding, time, effort, and devotion, and only you know whether you have sought the best spiritual help. If you are completely satisfied that you have given 100% of yourself to this endeavor, and if you have sought the help of the most highly developed spiritual help of which you are aware, it may be then that you will be faced with that question, should you resort to materia medica, and if you are faced with that question, you will receive the answer from within yourself. No one can ever make your decision for you. That is an utter impossibility, because it means that you are evading the issue. After all, it's your life, and you know whether you are ready to go the full distance of reliance on spiritual means, or whether you wish to take a suffer it to be so now and then start all over again. But that is something that every individual must solve for themselves. Those who do not have to engage in earning a living have much more opportunity and time to give to study and meditation for the attainment of spiritual consciousness. Is this evolutionary? In other words, have these students attained a greater degree of preparedness and receptivity to the word? By no means. By no means. No. In that case, it would only be necessary to be unemployed and go down and get unemployment relief and say, I've demonstrated spirituality, or find a rich relative to support one. No, that is evading the issue. A spiritual demonstration is based on starting from where I am. Right from where I am, I begin with what I have. What have you in the house? Well, I have 30 minutes before I leave my home to go to work. I have a certain amount of minutes on the train or in the bus. I have a noon hour, and I can spare 20 minutes of it. I have more time going home in the evening. I have a half hour before retiring, and I can certainly wake up in the middle of the night and spare another half hour from my sleep. That is starting where one is, and then gradually going on from there. In my own study, I was accustomed, as most people are, to an 8-hour night of sleep. But as my studies and healing work took up more and more time, it became necessary to have less time for sleep. And finally, my sleeping period reduced itself to 2 hours at night and 1.5 hours in the morning. And that went on for 15 years. And it didn't harm my health one single bit. If anything, I think it has improved it. Now, the reason is the intensity of the drive in one. That's all that counts, the intensity of the drive. I remember that I wanted to translate. I wanted to know some of the passages from Hindu scriptures. And the only way that I could find it for myself was to study Sanskrit. And the only place there was to study Sanskrit was in Harvard University. And when I applied there, they said, oh no, you can't come in here. You have no institutional background. I tried to convince them I'd been a reader in prison for 3 years, but that didn't seem to constitute institutional background. No, I didn't have institutional background, so I couldn't get in. But I wrote a letter to the dean of that course, and told him how necessary it was for me to take that course. It was a postgraduate course, incidentally. And without any question, an application came back and a request for so many dollars, and there I was in Harvard. And at the end of the year, when I asked the dean if I could come back for a second year, of course, he said, if you could survive the first, you can come back as many as you like. But how did you get here? And he didn't remember allowing me in because I had no institutional background. But I had an inner drive that had to be satisfied. And so, believe it or not, I got to my office at 7 o'clock in the morning to begin my practice, my healing work. And I went to Harvard at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and back to my office, and then worked until midnight to make up the lost time, and from midnight until 3 a.m. I did my homework every night. Now that's a drive. That's not leisure. That's not having money. That's not having somebody to support you. That is a drive. And if you have that drive, you can start with 1 hour that you have now and eventually make room to have as many hours as you need. I know these things from personal experience. I know you can do without sleep. I know you can do without food. That is, without a lot of the food that, well, you know that now too. You have seen that here in the war years, how little food you really can do with, and how much you can do without. And so all of these questions about these things, you see, are just evading the issue. It's a question of drive. Has the Spirit of the Lord God descended upon you, and is it driving you home? If not, of course, we all have alibis and excuses, and we really can have good ones too. Now, this, the Last Supper as established by Jesus. Am I right in thinking that he wanted his disciples to remember his teaching, the bread symbolic of substance and so forth? I really don't know. I believe that the spiritual interpretation of Scripture comes to us as we have need of it. And of course you know from the Infinite Way writings that I always refer to the bread, the wine, the water as spiritual substance, spiritual essence, all embodied in the I. But about the nature of that Last Supper, I really can't say. It may have been just a Jewish rite. Now the words from the cross, my God, why hast thou forsaken me, seem unreal when put beside your teaching of one power. There, you see, you are taking Scripture as if every word of it were gospel truth. And much of it is symbolic. Nearly all of it must be understood in some spiritual way. Now, first of all, let it be clear that there were no eyewitnesses to that crucifixion. There were no crowds there watching it. There were no hosannas. There was no pilgrimage along the way. None of that took place as an actual experience. How do we know? Well, all we have to do is go back in our history books to those days, to the manuscripts, and learn that crucifixion was a criminal punishment. It was ordered by the Roman governor, and it was carried out in the same way that they carried out all of their executions, undoubtedly up on Calvary. But in accord with their own military law, certainly not with an audience of people standing around close enough to hear those last words. And probably not at any time when the public would know about it. So that, who is to say if those words were ever spoken? And if by chance they were they those particular words? Were they so clearly enunciated from way up there on the cross in that condition that they could be clearly understood? All of those things you have to think about when you look for a literal experience and a literal statement. Only if the crucifixion took so much out of the Master in physical strength could there have been a temptation within him to make such a statement, to make such a call. I'm sure he could never have done it consciously, because he took upon himself that experience consciously and without having had any need to do it. He did it voluntarily to set forth a principle. He knew the painfulness of it in advance. And it isn't likely that under those conditions he would utter such words. If he did, it was only because he'd already passed from conscious control of himself to an unconscious one. And so, in that condition, he might have meant it literally. And otherwise, be assured of this, he didn't say it. If those of us attending this closed class were all doing so with greater heart knowledge, not only head knowledge, and at one in meditation, do you consider there would be sufficient power emanating from this room to bring about such an awareness of the spirit within amongst officials and those in authority, such as would end the strike troubles in London at the moment? Let me say this to you, that we could not generate enough spiritual power to heal a headache. But if for any reason the Spirit of God should so designate, you can be assured that any one of us in this room, if we were attentive, could be the instrument through which that could happen. I witnessed that when there was a bill before the Congress of the United States virtually to abolish the Supreme Court. Actually, in its wording, it didn't say that it meant to abolish it, it just meant to make it of no effect. But everyone knew that the purpose was to abolish it so that we would have one-man government. The Congress of the United States was already a rubber stamp. It was no longer functioning as a Congress. It was accepting bills from the President and rubber stamping them the same as the Reichstag did for Hitler. But there still was the Supreme Court standing in the way of totalitarian government. And as long as that Supreme Court stood inviolate, there could not be a one-man government in the states. And so this bill was introduced that would wreck the power of the Supreme Court and leave the President with totalitarian powers. No Congress to stop him, no Supreme Court to rule against him. All of this became very clear to me, and I could not understand the lethargy there seemed to be throughout the United States. It looked as if that bill were going to be rushed through without even an argument. And on one particular night, the voice said to me, "Do not go to bed. Stay up and pray about this Supreme Court bill." And I did. I stayed up and I meditated. I read, I meditated and read. And this went on all night until 4 o'clock in the morning. And at 4 o'clock in the morning there came a release, and the voice said, "It is done." and I retired. When I awakened, the newspapers were full of headlines. The Supreme Court bill means slavery, means one-man rule. And all of the newspapers across the United States took it up, and the man who was charged with putting the bill through the Senate went to the president and said, "I cannot do it. I can't." And he didn't, and the bill didn't pass. Sometime later, the man who was the head of one of our largest newspaper chains told this story, that morning at 4 o'clock he awakened out of a sleep, and something ran through his head saying, "This bill means slavery." And he jumped to his teletype and put that on the teletype all across the states, and his papers were the first to headline, "This bill means slavery." And then the rest of the papers took it up. That was one instance of how, when the Spirit wills, not a man, don't ever think for a minute that if the Spirit hadn't directed every single point of that, it would not have been done, for I of my own self can do no such things. Now again, we had a strike. And this is the first one that I was ever called in to help. I was called in by the side that represented capital. Within 24 hours, the strike was settled, and the man who led the strike for the union was thrown out of the union and has never again held a position in the union, for he was found to have gone beyond his function and led his men astray. In the next strike in which I was called to help, I was called by the president of the labor union. And this strike was settled within 24 hours when the men of the union realized that capital had been fair with them in its offer. And that strike ended in 24 hours. It doesn't require a room full. It requires, first of all, someone to let us in. You can be assured of this, that if the employer side were to call in a spiritual healer, one who understood the principles of his work, the strikes would end quickly. Or if the union side, whichever one, as long as one will let us into that table, our work can be effective and no one need ever see us or know that we're there. It doesn't take a room full, it takes one. But, number one, it must be one who knows the principles. Two, it must be that one is permitted to come in by being called one side or another, because it operates the same as it does in your family. You may have a sick family, and with all of the goodwill in the world, I might not be able to reach them. But if you ask for help for them and give us a way into that bedside, not physically, spiritually, the answer can be entirely different. So there must be two parts to it. First, there must be those who know the principle. Secondly, there must be someone in every case involved willing to allow us to break through spiritually, because the human mind holds us out. We will come to that later. Do you mean that the person suffering from a mere blister would, by fear of it or fearful imaginings, allow it to develop into a serious condition? Not necessarily. Not necessarily. In the human picture, a blister is an opening of the flesh, and if there are any dangerous microbes or germs around, they might get in, and if the system is run down, it can become infection or blood poisoning. Need not especially be fear or fearful imaginings. So that we have to do something about it regardless of whether there is fear or whether there is actual infection or contagion. We have to act or react to every appearance of material sense that touches our consciousness. In other words, if I am conscious of you out there with a cold, I can't ignore it up here. I must do something about it. If I walk on the street and I'm aware of somebody ill, I can't walk by and ignore it. I have to do something about it. What I do is within my own consciousness. It is a recognition of one power and the fact that form isn't power. But regardless of what I do, I have to do it within me, and I have to do it wherever, whenever I behold it. If I see bad news in the newspaper, I have to do something about it. I dare not allow any phase of material sense to touch my consciousness without doing something about it. And by doing something about it, I don't mean sympathize or pity or judge or condemn. I mean translate it. And that is why every single student of truth in all of this world is responsible for what is going on in the world more than others. For it is the truth students who have at least some knowledge of the principles of life and how to apply them. And of course, if they do not do it, they allow these conditions to be rampant. Whereas if they do respond and make translation of what they behold, very often they do stop what is going on. If Jesus was clothed with the same body after the resurrection, how was it his disciples at first took him to be somebody else? Well, now, isn't that perfectly clear that they weren't expecting him, for one thing, and weren't looking for him? Secondly, that he may have been invisible. And at first glance, they weren't looking for anybody invisible. And personally, I think that was the major reason, the fact that Jesus was not visible to human sense. We've brought that out so many times, that you cannot behold a spiritual demonstration with your physical eyes. You can only behold a spiritual demonstration if you are spiritually attuned. And if you wish to see the spiritual body of anybody, you have to develop your own spiritual faculties. And then you will behold spiritually. There seems to be a contradiction in the two following statements. The healer alone must accept responsibility for healing, and those who are so engulfed in material sense that they will resist healing. No, there's no contradiction there. When the Infinite Way teaches us that the healer alone must accept responsibility for healing, it doesn't mean that the practitioner should give you a written guarantee that you're going to be healed in spite of anything you may do to stop it. What it means is this: if you ask me for help, I must assume the responsibility of bringing out that healing, because I am the one who have the spiritual understanding, not the patient. If the patient had it, they wouldn't have asked me for help. Therefore, it is my responsibility to take over the claim and to do the work. Now, because I've taken that responsibility, doesn't mean that the healing is going to take place. It doesn't mean that you can't stop the healing taking place. It doesn't mean for a minute that every healing is going to take place. It only means that I am not going to say to you, now, if you were just a little more loving, or if you were more grateful, or if you read 4 more pages every day in my book, I'm not going to put that responsibility on you. I am going to take the same responsibility when you call on me that I would have to take if you called on me to help your pet dog. I couldn't ask the dog to go to church regularly, or to read so many pages of Scripture, or to hold the right thoughts, or to be more moral or more grateful. No, none of those things must be permitted to enter the question of spiritual healing. If you ask for help for one who is unconscious or dying, how can I turn to them and ask them to cooperate? It's impossible. I must accept the responsibility for doing the work, but I cannot be responsible if the healing does not take place. I am only responsible for giving my utmost to it in all faithfulness and with all integrity. There may be many reasons why healings do not take place. You only need turn to Jesus and his disciples to wonder what prevented Jesus healing Judas from whatever greed or lust was handling him, or what prevented Jesus from healing Peter, and so forth and so on. And you'll know that nobody can be responsible for healing everybody. That is one of the joys of all spiritual teaching, that it acknowledges you are an individual. You couldn't get away with that in communism, but you can in the spiritual teaching. You are an individual, and if you decide that you want to cling to your materialism, lust, greed, animality, you have that right. Nobody can break through. But that's your part of it. The practitioner's part is to accept the responsibility for doing the work and not evade it by saying, well, of course, you're not a member of our group. That makes it more difficult. Or you're not grateful. Or, well, I heard that you're immoral. All of that goes for nothing. And no one should indulge that in the infinite way. Accept the responsibility to take over the work and do it, and stand on your work. If something happens that looks like failure, don't believe that either. Because actually that which the world calls death itself is not failure. If it was so, then Jesus failed, and Paul and John and all of the great spiritual lights, well, they have all left this plane of consciousness. No, death is not always a failure. Sometimes the passing from this scene is a part of our very demonstration. That you cannot believe until you begin to catch a vision of what eternal life means, and God unfolding as individual consciousness. And then you'll realize how we rise step by step from infancy to youth, and youth to young manhood and womanhood and maturity, and so on, and keep right on and keep right on and keep right on until we keep right on walking out of this plane. Do not judge after appearances. Do not be too quick. Stephen was stoned to death. That apparently would be considered as a failure. Who is to say that that was a failure for Stephen? Who is to say? John boiled in oil. Who is to say that that is failure? Don't judge that way. Judge righteous judgment, and you may be given it to perceive how we evolve from one state of consciousness to another. Will you explain the meaning of the following words from Love and Gratitude? Should you experience what we know as death, you will find just what Jesus demonstrated, that you have not left a body here, you have taken your body with you. Consciousness is the basic substance. But consciousness cannot be unexpressed. Otherwise, you'd have a total vacuum. Therefore, consciousness, when it is expressed is expressed as form. And so it is. Every thought you have is clothed with form. Everything that exists has form. It may be a form invisible to your eyesight, but it has form. Every sound has form, even the sounds that you cannot hear. Many of you, I'm sure, know that animals, especially dogs and cats, have a hearing range greater than ours. And it is for this reason that when we have our pets with us, that sometimes when we hear nothing, they jump, run to the door, to the window. They have heard something. We haven't. We would have said there is no form present, but they know there is form, because their vision and their hearing are greater than ours, and therefore they know form before we do. So it is. There are colors so high in vibration that you cannot see them with your ordinary eyesight, and yet they're right here and have form. If you could step up the vibrations, you could see them. Or if you could step down their vibration, you could see them. But they're here, and they have form. So it is, if you close your eyes and say, I, you will realize that I am an entity. I am an identity. I am being. And of course, if I am, then I must have form, whether it is visible or invisible. There could be no such thing as an I existing as a vacuum. It has to exist as form. Jesus came again to the Mary and his disciples with the same body that was taken from the cross. It all comes back to the same identical thing. It's all a matter of form. Form. Everything has form. But are you at the level of consciousness where you can behold all form? And the answer certainly is no. No, you can only behold that which comes into the range of your present comprehension. It is very much like we often say, after we've read a passage of truth or a book of truth, and we don't understand it, and we come back to it a year later, and all of a sudden we say, oh, I see now. I see now. In other words, the principle now has taken form for me. It always had form, otherwise the author couldn't have written it. It always had form. But we read it, and it was meaningless to us. And then 6 months or a year later, we read it, and it was perfectly clear. We say, now I see. Why do we say, now I see, when we really don't see anything with our eyes? Because seeing and comprehending really are the same thing, and what we mean is, I comprehend. Comprehending, I see. Whereas before, I was blind, now I see. But the form was always there. This question about can you throw any light on the Word became flesh and the lost word? Yes. Yes, there is a tape, and it's right here in London, and it's 2 whole hours, called Flesh and Flesh, and it covers the entire subject of the Word. And I'm sure that you will be able to locate that tape probably through Mr. Eastman. Now, we come to this. Do you teach reincarnation in the sense that an individual can be born again in a future existence as a baby? If so, is there any New Testament basis for this view? I do not know whether there is any New Testament basis for this view, except, and this is a matter of interpretation, except that the Master did say to his disciples, Who do men say that I am? Now stop a minute before you come to the answer and ask yourself how a man could ever ask a question like that under those circumstances. To begin with, everybody in the Holy Lands knew who he was. First of all, he was the son of Joseph and Mary, and he had brothers and sisters, and he himself was a carpenter. And then he attended a Hebrew seminary, and he became an authorized rabbi, and he preached in the temple in Jerusalem. Now everybody in the Holy Lands knew that. Knowing that, now why should he say, who do men say that I am? The logical answer from any human standpoint would be, well, everybody knows who you are. You're one of the rabbis in the temple. Before that, you were a carpenter, and we all know your parents and brothers and sisters. But you see, there was a different meaning there. And they indicate that by their answer. Some say that you are a reincarnated Hebrew master, teacher. There must have been some teaching in those days on the subject of reincarnation, or they could never have believed or thought that he might possibly be some Hebrew master come back to earth. That may not be any New Testament basis for this view, but it does indicate that there was a teaching extant in those days on the subject of reincarnation. And so we come back to the first part, do you teach reincarnation? And I can't say that I do or that I don't. I can say that I believe in it. But I surely am not going to ask anybody else to believe in it because I do. I only believe in it because of certain experiences that have taken place in my own spiritual unfoldment. I cannot be convinced that Wesley LaViolette can be a professional organist at 3 years of age by studying organ from the time he's born until he's 3 years of age. Or that later in his life, never having studied Sanskrit or Pali, that he is ordered to sit down at a table and translate the Bhagavad Gita, and does it in 3 weeks. I can't believe that that could have happened without there being something of music and something of the Orient in that man. And that to me would indicate previous existence. In the same way, I cannot accept these great violinists and pianists who are on the public platform at 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years of age without believing that they came to this plane with that spiritual light. And that's only part of what has convinced me. Beyond that have been experiences which I've had of my own which convince me, but I wouldn't expect them to convince you. Because if you haven't had those experiences, you would just be having faith in my personal word. And I don't think that's a basis for teaching, asking anybody to believe because I tell them to. You must remember that in all this infinite way teaching, I am not asking anyone to believe what I'm teaching. I'm asking them to live it and demonstrate it. After they've demonstrated, they believe it. Before they have demonstrated, I don't see how they can believe it, regardless of how much faith they may have in me or in God, for that matter. What comes to you as demonstration is what carries your true faith. I believe in reincarnation, And those are some of the reasons. There's another reason why I believe it, in connection with Jesus Christ. We are told that he was a priest of Melchizedek. And there was no order of Melchizedek on earth at the time of Jesus. So they must have been going way, way back into the past to have found him to be a priest after the order of Melchizedek. Well, this other relates to that same thing. I understood you to say that individuals have had a previous human existence. And of course, the answer is the same. I believe it for these reasons and others of personal experience, but I am not teaching it. Or rather, not teaching that you should believe it. Now, would you kindly speak to us about specific work for a patient? You teach us not to direct treatment personally to a patient. But how are we to do about those we desire to help and who do not ask us to do so? You mean probably those who do not even come to you through some friend or relative? Then your only responsibility is to know the truth, and if they are receptive, they will respond to it, and if they are not receptive and do not respond to it, you have done all that you can. I believe that what you're trying to say is that you're determined that they're going to get well even if they aren't. And that is sort of taking from them their liberty. Everyone has the right to live or to die, and to live in accord with their own way of life. Now, if they want materia medica, you have no more right to interfere with their freedom than you would want them to come to your home with a doctor and say, here, you've got to have this doctor because I want you to get well my way. No. On the other hand, and this I referred to a few minutes ago, you do have a responsibility. If you know of someone who is ill, you can't afford just to pass by on the other side of the road and neglect them. You must retire for a moment within yourself and lift them up spiritually and realize their true identity and the fact that disease in and of itself is not power, and that there is no interference between God and the demonstration of God being. That is not only your right, but it is your duty. But that is as far as you have any right to go without the request of an individual or someone acting for an individual not capable of acting for themselves. In other words, a minor child. You can respond to the call of a parent, or a person who is mentally unbalanced and cannot know enough to ask for spiritual help, or an unconscious person, or a dying person. But aside from that, please give everybody the same freedom. For all you know, they may wish to pass on, and you have no right to prevent them from fulfilling their higher sense of right at any given moment, for you cannot live their lives for them. Now, let us come to this very important point. If there is sin, disease, death, lack, and limitation on earth, it exists for only one reason, there is a universal hypnotism that constitutes what we call human life. It isn't your fault, it isn't my fault, it isn't anyone's fault. It began whenever it was that the human mind accepted the belief of two powers, good and evil. The very moment that the belief of good and evil came into consciousness, universal consciousness, that was the moment when our humanhood began, and we had to earn a living by the sweat of our brow, and we had to bring forth children with labor and pain, and we had to know sin, disease, and death. Up to that time, up to that moment, when this belief in two powers became prevalent in human experience, there were no such things as sins, diseases, or death. Now, we are born into this world of two powers, the good power and the evil power. And from the moment of conception, we are being played upon by the thoughts of parents, doctors, nurses, aunts, uncles, and cousins, all of whom are expressing fear right from the time the young expectant mother announces that she's expecting. From that moment on, somebody's fearing for her, that she won't eat properly, or that she'll fall down a step, or she's just completely surrounded with human anxiety and human fear, and the belief in two powers, and not only the belief in two powers, but just notice that evil is really the most important power that we're talking about. We seem never to tell her about the good power. Then the child is born, and instantly it must not get in a draft. And from then on begins that parade all down through its life. Two powers, but the major power is the evil power. That gets into our consciousness, consciously and unconsciously, or subconsciously. Some of the things we fear never were feared by our parents or those around us. We've just taken to them from out here in the universal. Up until recently, it was not known how this happened. But in this past year, we've learned how it happens. And the way it was brought home to mankind was through this invention of which I spoke to you here as long ago as 2 years. This subliminal perception, by means of which an ad, an advertisement can be flashed on a television screen or moving picture screen so fast that you cannot see it, you cannot hear it, and you do not know that it happened. But it said, go downstairs and buy Coca-Cola, and 57% went right downstairs and bought Coca-Cola. Now, they didn't want it. They were watching a movie, but no, without knowing why, they got right up out of their seats and went downstairs and bought Coca-Cola. On another occasion, the message flashed was, go to your telephone. That came over a television screen. And you don't know how many people got up from their seats watching an exciting story on television to go to the telephone and then discover they didn't want anything when they got there. Now, they didn't see it or hear it. But we are told that it operates this wise. It enters your subconscious. Now you know why it is that you sometimes wake up in the morning when you think you should be feeling fine and decide, oh, I feel terrible today. You do not know what was pumped into your consciousness while you slept. Because it doesn't have to enter through your thinking mind, it can enter through the subconscious. And so we know that very often when you have a cold or grip or flu, it isn't because you've come in contact with germs, It's because it's been in the air and you picked it up. Now, it is in this wise that all of us pick up these suggestions, and you'll find it in my writings all the way back to the beginning, that this is the way error begins. It exists out here, right here in this room, as a universal suggestion. All over this world, messages are going back and forth in mind. And you sit here, and you pick up one, and this one picks up another, and this one picks up another, and so forth. And we go out then and demonstrate what we've picked up, and then we say, where did that come from? And it's really true. Where did it come from? Because we weren't consciously thinking about it. That is the one answer we get mostly on the subject of how did we catch a cold. I wasn't thinking about it. How did we get polio? I wasn't thinking about it. No, you weren't, but the universal mind was. And here comes the big part for us. The world at this moment cannot help being victimized by this universal mind. It just cannot help it. It has no defense. It doesn't know that it's going on, and it doesn't know how to protect itself. But that has not been true of us in this message of the infinite way ever since this message began, because I have been teaching how to avoid those things. First of all, how to be healed of them if you fell victim to it. Secondly, how to avoid getting them to begin with. They are in our writings. Certainly they are specifically given in every year of our letters. You will find entire chapters in 54, 5, 6, and 7, and I know in 8, on how to do a daily protective work that will prevent you picking up these things and responding to them. And of course the proof that this is true is that those who follow seriously this work find that within a year or 2 or 3 of their study, they are having far less of the claims of the world than they ever had before. And we found this, that last year during the Asian flu epidemic, that we went through that entire experience without one single call from an infinite way student for help. Anywhere in the world, nowhere did we have a claim for help, because we are handling these things for our students. We have groups all around this world working every single day to nullify this miasma, this mesmerism of human belief. And to some extent we are succeeding, but we will exceed to a fuller extent when every student participates. In other words, in each one of these year's books, and I particularly know the articles in 55, 6, and 7, and I believe there's one in 54, there is an entire section devoted to daily protective work. I know there's one recently in 58. Now, you may say, protective work, that indicates 2 powers. No, it doesn't. Not if you understand spiritual language. Because our protective work is the self-protection from the universal belief that there are 2 powers. You are unprotected when you do not consciously realize this, because you unconsciously or subconsciously accept the world's estimate. There are 2 powers, good and evil, God and devil, immortal and mortal. And only when you consciously nullify that, by realizing several times a day, I and my Father are one. I I am subject only to the impartation of spirit from within me. I am not receptive or responsive to the suggestions of the carnal mind. That is, the mind that believes in two powers. I do not respond to the belief that there is good and evil, that there's a right side or wrong side. I am not judging. I am judging righteous judgment, which is the realization that God in the midst of me is the only power. God in the midst of you, God in the midst of my friends, and God in the midst of my enemies. This alone is power.